Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Comics Lair for our Salute to Superman. The Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and we'll start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about themselves, and briefly describe their involvement with comic books and Superman. Ian, do you want to start?
There we go. It's that missing mute button that I couldn't find. Hi, I'm Ian J. Malone. I do the author thing. I am author of the Mako Saga, the Swamp Eagle Security Trilogy over in the Four Horsemen universe. I've also written in a number of other anthologies, everything from sci-fi to post-apoc. I got a brand new book coming out March 17th called The Last Argonaut, which is set in the Salvage title universe that I'm absolutely ecstatic about. It's like every sports movie you've ever imagined, but 9,000 years in the future with aliens and spaceships. So good stuff there. A lifelong Superman fan. I've been following this stuff since we believed a man could fly, and I guess it was 1977. And I have been a big fan of the Big Blue Boy Scout ever since. So I'm happy to be here.
Okay, Chris?
I'm Chris Cavett. I'm not a comics professional in any way. I work in IT. I'm a lifelong fan. I discovered Superman in 1966 or 67 by watching the Filmation cartoon. And a few years later, when I was old enough to read, I started reading Superman in action and other titles that Superman was in. I've been a fan almost my whole life.
Okay. Ange?
Hey, I'm Ange, and I'm a lifelong comic reader. I was an early reader as a kid, and comics were thrown at me, and Superman very quickly became a favorite, and Supergirl actually became my absolute favorite. And I have been blogging about Supergirl and adjacent to that, Superman and the Legion of Superheroes for 15 years now, and I'm a huge fan. So honored to be on this panel with everybody.
Elektra?
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer and an editor. I grew up watching George Reeve playing Superman on TV. I didn't get to reading comics until I was in college. I did share a dorm, well, not at the same time, but I did live in the same dorm as Christopher Reeve did, which was kind of fun. He was kind of a legend back where we were. But Superman has been one of my favorites through time. And I was lucky enough to know one of the Superman writers when I was through college, as he was one of the members of our local comic book club. It was Roger Stern, who wrote, well, we'll get to there.
Okay. Well, and those of you who come here often know that I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books, independently publish several subgenres of romance, and with Jeannie Adams write the Outcast Station science fiction adventure series. I've been a comics fan since I was about 8 years old. My first comic book was an issue of Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, and it was an Elastic Lad issue that had the Phantom Zone and Mon-El was in it, which proved to be a gateway drug to the Legion of Superheroes. And so I've just always loved Superman. I don't understand why people say it's hard to tell a Superman story. I mean, he's been in 17,000 comic books. At least 17,000 people have found a way to do it. So anyway, tonight, that's what we're going to talk about, why we appreciate and like Superman. And so let's pick up with that. We've all said how we discovered Superman, but why did you like him? Chris, will you start?
Why did I like him? When I was younger, I just he could fly. He had all those superpowers. I was 3 years old when I discovered him. It didn't take a lot. He had superpowers. He had a bright, colorful costume. And I think some of the cartoons they showed at the time were Superboy cartoons. I loved Krypto. So Krypto had a lot to do with selling me on Superman. I was an easy sell.
Okay. Ange?
I got into reading comics because, of course, they're escapist fantasy. And so having somebody shoot laser beams out of their eyes, trash a car with their hands, fly into outer space, meet aliens, all of that stuff was great. But there are lots of comic book characters that can do that sort of stuff. And so for me, it was this feeling that Superman just got it, right? He was a moral guy. He was an ethical guy. He was a nice guy. He could take over the planet if he wanted to. He didn't, right? He would save the cat in the tree as much as he would beat up Luthor, much as he would stop a meteor from like destroying all of Metropolis. And so there really was something, I would say, very inspirational about him that as a kid, you could say, man, like, I hope one day I'm like Superman, right? That I have the power to help people and I do it, right? So I think that really was it. And then as I grew up a little bit and realized like, man, I'm never going to be Superman, but I want to be like him. That led me into liking Supergirl, who I think is very much like, I want to be like Superman. I hope I can be like Superman one day.
Yeah. Elektra?
I think Ange hit on a real good piece of that. Superman was as American as apple pie. He was one of us. He was that Iowa farm boy. Well, not from Iowa, but he was corn-fed and one of us. And he was good and right, and he was a Boy Scout, and he always did the right thing, even if it hurt. And, that was it. You always want to do what's right. And he was the person you strove to be and that you could always look up to. And that's what we want our heroes to be. And there was just no ambiguity with Superman. He's just the guy that always does the right thing.
Okay, Ian?
So I'm going to sound like the broken record here, but exactly what everybody just said. I love a complex hero. I love anti-heroes. I love to get into the psychology of why it is that people do what they do, whether they're heroes or they're villains or somewhere in between. But sometimes it's just nice to root for the good guys. And Superman was always that. There was never anything to confuse about him. He was the good guy who was going to do the right thing to the best of his ability because it was the right thing to do. And there's no gray area. There's nothing to read between the lines. He's just a good dude. And, as some of the comics brought out later, that really kind of focused on his upbringing, when you get into the Smallvilles of the world and things like that, which I'm sure we'll all touch on later, and you get to know Jonathan and Martha and you see how he was raised, and it made so much sense. And, for all of the people out there who would say, well, Superman's just not a relatable character. And I would argue that he's more relatable than most people in comics. That was my family that tried to, I was very blessed in that regard, that I was raised by a mom and dad who tried to teach me a lot of those ideals. And so, when I met Superman for the first time as a kid, there was a lot about that character that really resonated with me, why he did what he did, why he carried himself. And then, for crap's sake, dude, the guy could fly, heat vision, all that cool stuff. It was awesome. So, to echo what everybody else on this panel has said so far, Superman is just the ultimate good guy. And I love him for that. It's what makes that character, and it's why I still love him today.
Yeah, well, I'll dive into the echo chamber too. But for me, it's also the fact that I was seriously a nerd child. I was uncoordinated. I was always growing, so I never knew where my body was in space, which makes it very difficult to do athletic things. And I was surrounded by kids who were athletic. And so Superman was pure escapism for me. And then add on to it what everybody said about he always does the right thing. It's what I like about Camelot. It's the idea of might for right. And yeah, I know with Camelot, it's kind of see me underneath, but it's not with Superman. Superman is might for right. And I've never liked the stories that twist it, that red kryptonite stories or whatever like that. It's just not for me. So with now that we've sort of established what we like about Superman, who do you think is the best supporting cast for Superman? Pick your favorites and tell us why you picked them. And you want to start?
No. Well, the one thing I'll say about him is that he's got a great supporting cast. And a lot of times in comics these days, subplots and supporting cast are cast aside. And I think it's a shame. I love Jimmy Olsen as a normal person sidekick who gets into zany adventures as Mr. Action, tries to do what's right. I'm going to be an investigative journalist. His heroes are Clark and Lois and Superman, right? So I think Jimmy is a great point of view character. You know, growing up, he's wearing a weird green jacket with a bow tie. He's on a motorcycle. He's trying to do what's right. You could see yourself as Jimmy Olsen as much as you could see yourself like Superman. Obviously, Lois is somebody that I absolutely love. She's like the perfect, you know, she's an equal to him in so many ways, even though she has no powers, which I think just makes her even that much more powerful. I love it in stories where it's like Superman couldn't do something, but Lois wrote a story and she did something, right? That's really amazing. So I will say that I love those two characters for the Metropolis set. Obviously, for me, Supergirl has a very special place in my heart. And I will say it is because she's been through some stuff, but she's always, in my mind, not in every interpretation, optimistic and bright, and looks to Superman as a role model and tries to get there. But she's young and she can fail and she can have a temper and she can lose, all of those sort of things. And as a kid reading, I was like, man, that's a lot more like me than Superman. She's kind of a character that I can sort of like, you know, hitch my wagon to. She actually had 10 jobs in 6 years in the 70s. As a kid, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. It was like, boy, if Supergirl can't figure it out, I'm okay, right? You know, like I'll get there. So I would say those three, Lois, Jimmy, and Supergirl.
Okay. Elektra?
From the growing up watching Superman and Lois Lane and having Lois Lane consistently scoop him for the stories was very empowering for me, because Superman was Superman, and yet Lois was always the one who managed to get those stories in. And she got her name on them for the longest time before they finally, you know, managed to get Clark in there so that he could actually do some stuff too. And it made me feel like I could do anything. And, you know, growing up with a very complicated family that I am not getting into, I really identified with Lois as it doesn't matter that he's Superman, I can do stuff. I know she didn't know he was Superman, but we all did. And through her various incarnations, I really appreciated that there was a strong woman there that was, you know, I'm sorry, I'm pushing you aside and I'm going to go after the story. I mean, we'll get into the incarnations later, but she was always one of my favorite things to watch throughout everything, was just Lois Lane.
Okay. Ian?
I'm going to go with his parents, Jonathan and Martha Kent. You know, I mean, for anybody who's ever been a step parent, that's a hard job. You know, raising somebody else's kid is a tricky thing, and I can't fathom how much more difficult that would be if you inherited that kid to take on. You know, I mean, I think that the level of patience, the level of grace that they displayed on pretty much every level, whether you're talking about the comics, whether you're talking about television shows or movies, that was always a constant. Was, you know, his family really raised him to be the man that he is. That's where he derives a lot of his identity. And that is not an easy job for a step parent, much less for the step parents of a kid with that kind of power. And so I always felt like that was just a super, super admirable just an aspect of the character. We'll obviously get into, you know, incarnations and all that later on down the line. And obviously I have my favorite on that. But yeah, I'm gonna say Jonathan and Martha Kent, man. Those folks are heroes.
Okay. Chris?
Now I'm in the position where I think I get to say that I agree with what everyone else has said. I think in the comics that Lois, Jimmy, and Perry White are just the best supporting casts that any comic book hero has ever had. And I'd give the nod to Lois as first among them because of the confidence and the capability. And she's really a hero in her own right. But overall, I'd have to agree that it's the Kents, because what everyone said about Superman being a Boy Scout, and I don't know if all of you have heard this, but people say that that's what makes Superman boring, that he acts like a Boy Scout, so he's boring. That's what makes him fascinating, that he has the powers of a god, basically. Power corrupts, power tempts. He could do anything he wanted to, and no one could stop him. But he's better than all of us, in spite of all the temptation to be worse. And the Kents instilled those values in him. You could make an argument, I think, that in the DC universe, the greatest heroes we've ever seen are Jonathan and Martha Kent. And look at what they saved us from.
Yeah. Well, I don't disagree with anything anybody has said. I've enjoyed the use of Jonathan and Martha in recent years. Like, they bring Bruce Wayne home, and Bruce doesn't really quite entirely know how to react to this when he's having dinner at the Kent farm. And it was kind of sweet. And I totally agree that without Jonathan and Martha, we maybe get, what was it, Red Superman, where he crash landed in Russia, or, someone like that. But I would add, and we'll talk about her in a little bit, but I really miss Lana Lang. I think there should be a place for Lana Lang. Maybe because I grew up reading Silver Age Superboy, and Lana Lang was a big character in that. And I agree with what Elektra said about Lois. And I think that's one reason why I so disliked the issues of Lois Lane that were all about Lois and Lana trying to figure out Superman's secret identity so he would have to marry one of them. I mean, gag me with a spoon. That is just no. Not a good comic for young girls to be reading, frankly. So, yeah, I liked what
Archie Comics.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's an Archie Comics storyline.
Yeah, I liked the romantic suspense stories with Lois, where she's out on an investigative story, and then, Superman might have to save her when the villain throws her off a building, but Lois, as Elektra noted, got the story. So I always liked that aspect of it. And so, have I gotten everybody weighed in on that? Anybody want to add anything? No?
Well,
Okay.
I'll say I have a warm spot for Lana as well. There's always something about your first love, right? And she's the one that he first revealed that he had powers to. And so there's always that little thing inside him about her that I think everybody kind of knows. I think, I assume everybody has that, there was that girl, there was that boy, there was that someone when I was a kid. So I do like when they bring her back, and you can kind of see him maybe get a little bit flustered, or maybe a little bit flushed in the cheeks, right? That there's still a little spark there.
Well, let's look at something that has the potential to be a little bit controversial. Some of us are Legion of Superheroes fans, and the Legion of Superheroes was historically, in the original DC universe, inspired by Superboy. John Byrne, however, had other plans, and the company allowed him to retcon Superman's Superboy era. I'm not talking about the other Superboys who popped up since. They allowed him to retcon away Superman's having been Superboy and inspired the Legion of Superheroes. So, do you think that's a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Do you think it could have been better differently? What's your opinion, Elektra?
I really liked the original Legion of Superheroes. And John Byrne can do some amazing things. I love some of his writing. I love some of his artwork, but this was not one of my favorite things that he did. He is not everything he does is the right thing. There are some writers, I will follow them everywhere, but I'll read the original and leave it at that.
Okay. Ian?
I'm going to stick with the original myself. I'm just not a big fan of retconning stuff. You better have a really, really good reason for why that is, and a really compelling reason at that. Otherwise, I just kind of feel it's change for change's sake, and that never sells with me. So yeah, I mean, I'm, personal preference, I'll stick with the original.
Chris?
100%. I think the Legion's just never been the same since that connection to Superboy was broken. I did like a few of the things that John Byrne did. I tried to like John Byrne's Superman in the beginning, and I liked that the Kents were still alive. I liked that Superman was such a close friend to Lana and that he had shared his identity with her. But yeah, I don't like what Byrne did to the Legion. Not at all.
Okay. Ange?
I'm going to be a little bit more gray, I think, in my answer. I think if you think about the mid-'80s for DC, it was like a creative explosion when you think about really post-Crisis, and I would say more post-Legends, when a new Justice League was coming out and Suicide Squad and all of those things were being reimagined a little bit. And you go from Kurt Swan still drawing Superman, written by Paul Kupperberg, which I love, but then John Byrne comes on and there's just energy, right? And so it is a new take on Superman, but people were excited about Superman back then. People were reading like, oh my gosh, did you read Superman, right? You know, and you get Marv Wolfman and Jerry Ordway and all of these people that are like legends to come on board. And so I think that I'm a big fan of the original. I have way more Silver Age comics in these boxes than I care to tell you, but I think Byrne brought energy. I do think that getting rid of Superboy destroyed, right? The Legion, as someone said, has suffered since that decision, right? It was based on valor, no, it was, it was based on Mon-El, right? And all these different things, and I think that as a huge Legion fan, it's been hard for them to sort of cobble something together that still makes sense. So I would say I wish that Superboy still existed. I'm glad we don't have Super Toddler. I don't know if I want Superboy in Smallville, because then Superboy has left Smallville and went to Metropolis. Clark Kent was in Smallville. So I think you have to kind of put a little bit of a modern spin on it. But from a Legion point of view, I think it's been tough. I wish, and I know we'll probably talk about this later, John Kent could have been it was based on John Kent. But we'll touch on that later, I bet.
We will definitely touch on that later. I became a Legion fan shortly after becoming a comics fan. And so I loved the Silver Age Legion. Yes, the art was stiff. Yes, the stories were a little stiff, but they had real heart to them. And this was outer space adventure, and there were girls with powers, and that was just awesome. And on top of that, the Romance Writers of America have a concept called the book boyfriend. And it's a guy in a book that you would go out with if he was real. And my book boyfriend when I was in grade school, and really he kind of still is, was Silver Age Superboy, because I just thought he was all the things that Superman was, and he was so cool. My two book boyfriends of that era of my life were Dick Grayson and Clark Kent / Superboy. So retconning away my book boyfriend is not a popular move with me. And I'm also, as a lifelong Legion fan, practically, it just tore the Legion continuity apart, and it ripped into the existing run. And that's how we got the Pocket Universe. And I believe that was Levitz and Giffen. I'm not positive. And I think they did the best they could with it, but they basically had a hand grenade tossed into all their plans for the book. And I don't think it's ever been the same since. And the Supergirl TV show tried to say, well, we're basing it on Supergirl. And I like Supergirl, but I liked the original. And that's what I grew up with. And as I've said on panels before, I tend to be really loyal to whatever I fall in love with first. And so that's just kind of it for me. But now that we've talked about the Byrne period and the changes it brought, do you have a favorite era or arc of Superman? Ian, do you want to start?
I would say, I don't know that it's a favorite, but it's probably the most memorable, only because it happened at a time in my life when this stuff was huge. And that is the Death of Superman arc, the Death and Life of Superman arc in the early 90s. I was in middle school, coming up on, actually, no, I guess I was in high school by that point. And it was everywhere. This is before really the internet. This is before social media. And it was a cultural phenomenon that you could not escape, even if you weren't a comics fan. And I remember going down to the comic shop, which was walking distance from my school, and just having these hours long discussions with the owner about well, this is how it could have happened. This is how it should have happened. I like this. I didn't like that. When are you going to get this? When are we going to get resolution to this? And I mean, it was just I don't remember a time when I talked about it as much as I did for that arc. And obviously that's low hanging fruit, Death of Superman. But I mean, for a 14-year-old kid, it was everything at the time. That was my hero. And they just took him out. And again, this is before the internet. So there's no guarantees he's coming back. You don't know that. You just know he's gone. And that hammered me. So I'll go with that one for most memorable.
Okay, Chris?
For me, it's the Weisinger era. Just such an amazing, seemingly endless universe of possibilities. All the different types of kryptonite, the Bottle City of Kandor, the Legion, the Superman Revenge Squad, the Superman Emergency Squad. There was you just never knew what was going to happen. Lori Lamaris, and it seemed like all of these different aspects were just constantly being brought together in various bizarre combinations. It just really captured my imagination as a kid. I was not reading comics during the Weisinger era, but the back issues were widely available and very inexpensive. And I love them, especially the 80-page giants. Those were treasures.
Ange?
Death of Superman is a great one. And I think the thing about that is each subsequent story became stronger. Like the fight against Doomsday is okay. Funeral for a Friend is great. And then Reign of the Superman, when it's 4 different people and you're trying to figure out the mystery, is just great. And then Superman comes back and that's great, right? And so that was a story that I feel had momentum and really lasting issues, right? All of those characters still are with us today. So that's a great choice. As a kid, I would say there was a period where I was reading Superman off of the spinner rack at 7-Eleven, the Carrie Bates, Marty Pascow sort of stuff, again, drawn by Kurt Swan, that I think was mythology to me, right? Writing down the names of the different Phantom Zone villains. There was no internet back then, right? Writing down what the different kryptonites did, writing down, Vartox is from this planet and that sort of stuff, that I think just showed me that there was a whole universe out there around this character. And then when you read things like Superman Family, so I would say I'm dating myself, but probably early 80s sort of stuff is where that's really where it cemented my love for the character. If I had to pick something new, it's going to sound trite. All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison, I think, captures a lot of the Silver Age love with a little bit of a modern take on it. That's something that I can give non-Superman fans and say, read this. This is why I'm a Superman fan. And I think they can get it.
Okay, Elektra?
I got to put in another vote for the Death and Life of Superman. At least partly because I was a little bit more involved in looking at Superman then, because Roger was working on it. I will put in a vote for something a little bit more recent, the stuff that Brian Michael Bendis has done more recently, only because I am a huge fan of John Romita Jr.'s art. And I will look at anything he's doing. But those storylines have not been half bad. And I've kind of enjoyed watching what he's doing with it. It's been fun.
Well, I actually come down more on Chris's side of the question. I love the Bottle City of Kandor stories and Nightwing and Flamebird. And that whole period, that really kind of reached out and grabbed me. And this was slightly after that, I think, when the first time that Clark and Lois developed a relationship, Beef Bourguignon, and he finally told her who he was. And then I really like, even though it's not a momentous, it kind of marks an occasion. It's not an earth-shattering story. It doesn't really lead to anything amazing. Is the 2-parter that preceded the Byrne run called Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. And it's such a tribute story to Superman and to all his connections in the DC universe and his importance to that universe that I just loved it. I bought the little trade paperback because I just thought, I want this. I'm going to pull this off from time to time and read it, just because it truly seemed to me to be written with a real love for the character. And so that would be it for me. There was something somebody said that I was going to go. Who is your favorite Superman artist? If you could pick all the artists who've drawn Superman, who would you pick? Chris?
Kurt Swan. Just classic. He drew those back issues that I was loving in the 70s, the ones from the 60s that were inexpensive and widely available. And then he was drawing all the new issues that were coming out during my first years as a comic fan. And it just, I don't know, Kurt Swan's Superman is what Superman looks like in my head.
Ange?
I'm going to say Dan Jurgens. It used to be Kurt Swan. When I would picture Superman in my head, it would be Kurt Swan. But I would say about the last 15 years, it's been Dan Jurgens, who I think, as a writer-artist, really understands Superman, still understands Superman today.
Elektra?
John Romita Jr. and maybe some Neil Adams. I really like both of their art a lot.
Okay. Ian?
I'll throw in another vote for Kurt Swan. You just can't go wrong with the classics. And when we think of Superman and all of his glory, tough to beat those.
Well, I have to fall into that camp too, but I would pick Swan pencils with inks by Murphy Anderson. One of my geek highlights of my geek experience was I was volunteering at Heroes Convention one year, and we had an art show, and the art had to be locked up every night. And so a bunch of us had gone up to get the art and put it out for the show. And I came out of the elevator with my arms full of stacked art, and Murphy Anderson was coming in the hallway doorway, and he stopped and backed up and held the door for me. And I came home and said, Murphy Anderson held the door for me. Like, that's nice. It's like, so, but that's not why I'd pick him. I just think that Swan and Anderson were a good match. And like Swan and George Klein on the Legion seemed to be a good pair. So I would pick that. Who's your favorite Superman villain? Ange, I think we're up to you.
First, I'll just say Superman 233, signed by Murphy Anderson. I met him at a con. Amazing guy. Brainiac. I think Brainiac brings a lot of gravitas to the whole thing. Intergalactic, destroys cultures, has the space feel of Superman, but is attacking Earth, which sort of ties it into his Earth stuff. I think is a big enough threat. So Brainiac is my number one, but Mxyzptlk is probably a close second.
Okay, Elektra?
Lex Luthor. I mean, persistence. You got to give him something for that. He just won't quit.
Okay. Ian?
On the screen, obviously
Anywhere.
It's Lex Luthor as played by Michael Rosenbaum. Best version of that character I've ever seen, bar none. It's not even close. On the page, I'll go with Brainiac. I'm a sci-fi guy. I love all the space aspect of what he brings to the table. And I like really, really, really smart villains. And he's obviously got that in spades. So
Chris?
Luthor and the old classic Luthor, the scientist, not the businessman and the one who hates Superman because he turned him bald. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I guess Luthor didn't like it.
I'm really torn between Brainiac for the reasons everybody said and Lex Luthor as well, like Elektra said, because he is persistent. And Lex Luthor is smart enough to do things that they may not be at Brainiac's planet-threatening level. Lex is not going to shrink a city and put it in a little bottle, but he can give Superman a run for his money if he gets ready to go. And so I would pick Lex for that. So does anybody want to say anything else about Superman in the comics before we move to other media? No? Okay. Well, let's pick up with character we mentioned a while ago, Lana Lang. Do you see any way for Lana Lang to have a role in Superman's current continuity in any venue? Elektra?
in media, they're doing a fantastic job with her in Superman and Lois, where Superman and Lois have moved back to Smallville, and Lana is Superman's best friend from when he was growing up. And there is lots of storyline there. But she's finally found out that he's Superman, and now it all makes sense.
Okay, Ian?
So I'm going to go a little dark side here on you guys. I could see Lana, and bear in mind, like my thought on Lana Lang is always going to go back to Smallville, as played by Kristen Crook. If I was going to write something today, it's often been said that the best, you can't hurt Superman, but you can hurt the people around him. If God forbid something were ever to happen to Lois, like something very final was ever to happen to Lois, I could see Lana Lang being a great confidant because of that connection. And it could be something that one day down the line, she's the person who can kind of unlock him to bring him back to himself, because his parents are gone. He doesn't really have anybody else outside of the superhero crowd that can understand what he's going through. That childhood connection of friendship, and at one point could have been something more, may have been something more, depending on what series you're reading. She could be a great way to kind of bring out the humanity of a guy who's really feeling something, even with all this power, to know that he was powerless to stop that from happening. She could walk him through that. And I think that would be a great use of that character.
Chris?
I would like to see her the way that I talked about. I liked how John Byrne wrote her as Clark's best friend and the only person outside of his family that he had confided his identity in. I think she could work really well in that role. I like what Elektra was talking about in the new TV show, how now he's confided in her and now she knows and everything makes sense. But I don't think it has the same value when he's married to Lois and he has Lois to confide in and know his secrets.
Ange?
Yeah, I'll say, Chris, you took the words out of my mouth. When he confided to Lois and married Lois, it kind of took away the special relationship that he had with Lana. Like, if nobody knew that he was Superman except her, he could use her as a sounding board. I'm having a difficult time living these two lives, and I'm struggling, and how can I do that? And I like the Lois relationship that he's had over these last few decades. But I do think that is a missed opportunity for him to have somebody that he can sort of talk to in that way. I wouldn't mind seeing her coming back like she did in like the 80s, where I'm now a journalist myself, but on television, working for a rival, media organization. Could add a little grist to the mill to sort of bring some stories out. I did not necessarily like Greg Pak when he was writing Superman, I would say in the early 2000s, made her like an electrical engineer action scientist. And I don't think that was right. I don't need superhero Lana Lang.
But one of the things I liked about superhero Lana Lang was she was actually growing closer to Lois, which has been one of the nice things about Superman and Lois, is that they didn't do. If this were a comic book in the 1970s, there would be a lot of envy and distrust between Lois and Lana, because that's how people tended to write those characters back then. But I like the best friend thing and the childhood friend thing, because there's something about a childhood friend who's known you through all these phases of your life and still is your friend that makes it easier to confide in them. And I liked the way that she was getting closer to Lois, because Lois doesn't really have female friends. And for that matter, aside from Jimmy, Clark doesn't really have male friends. His friends are in the Justice League. Those are the people he's candid with and talks to when he has a problem. And Lois doesn't have a Justice League. So I would sort of like to see Lana be Lois's friend in the comics the way she's becoming Lois's friend on the TV show. Because I just think that that's a good use of the character, and it's in some ways more realistic. Most people have connections outside their immediate nuclear family. And so they don't really seem to have a lot of those. Superman and Lois don't. And I would like to see them have more of an opportunity for that. What do you think of the Superman family? His marriage to Lois as it exists now in the comics, and to some extent on TV, they're not exactly the same, but they're a lot alike. Superman married to Lois, and then John Kent. Ian, you start?
Yeah. I mean, when I think about Superman marrying Lois, I think about the 90s. Obviously that was a big to-do in the comics. And then, in that day and age, we were watching Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. And so, I remember The Ring and the Night and all that with Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher. And it was cool. I will admit to have kind of bowed out of reading comics not long after that time. So there's a lot of stuff that happened there that I'm not as familiar with as I was the earlier stuff. Keeping it kind of in the context of film and the screen, it seems to me that was kind of the point when things, the stories to me just weren't as strong. I always loved the relationship of Lois and Clark. And I love the fact that their marriage is the stuff that you would expect from a Superman relationship. The way they lean on each other, the way they confide in each other, the way they communicate and respect each other. That was awesome. The stories just didn't really seem to land with me beyond that point. So I tend to stick with the earlier stuff.
Okay. Chris?
I like the idea of Superman being married to Lois, like you were talking about Nancy, just that old secret identity, trying to protect it, trying to discover it, like all of that just got really old. And even long before Superman was married, I liked that the Flash was married to Iris West, or I liked that Hal Jordan confided in his mechanic, that was unusual back in the day. And so I liked that Clark told Lois who he was and married her. I think that's a good move, and I'm glad that it stuck. It seems that now it's in the TV show. It seems like it's not the new unusual thing anymore, that it's become, this is how it is. And I think that's a good thing.
Ange?
Yeah, it just feels right for them to be together and married. I like when it is that she and Clark fell in love with each other and then he revealed he was Superman, rather than she falls in love with Superman and he reveals that he's Clark. So I think that's a slight wrinkle that I think is great. It humanizes him very much, right? I would rather have him, because I think of him as he's Clark, right? And he's this good guy. That's what we've all talked about. And so the fact that he fell in love with a hardworking, industrious Earth woman, I think really cinches again who he is as a character. I did not like in the New 52 when it was him and Wonder Woman. That's kind of boring, I think, right? That's like a little bit too on the nose, and that's not Superman, right? In the Byrne run, when he was attracted to Wonder Woman, he said, "I'm just a guy from Kansas, and you're on Mount Olympus, right? Like we don't have much in common." So I think it's right. I'm glad, I think it was in Convergence, believe it or not, that they brought about John Kent. And I thought having John Kent as a 12-year-old was perfect, because he's got that energy and he can team up with Damian and he's learning the ropes from his dad. One thing that Bendis did do was age him. So he went from 12 to 18 overnight, which I think robbed us of a lot of stories in between. I like John Kent as a character. I don't know if I like him at 18, or at least I haven't glommed onto him quite yet at that age. So.
Okay. Elektra?
I love Lois and Clark as a married couple. They were together for so long working. I mean, two people working that hard, it's sort of, that's where they would find their companionship. I mean, at least in the time that was where you met people who you worked with. Nowadays, less so. They didn't have swipe left, swipe right back then. And I'm much more comfortable with the idea of aging people up as somebody who's, I'll admit it, I'm an old soap watcher, and I'm very conversant with the soap opera rapid aging syndrome, where overnight kids get aged up to a convenient age for the story. So I'm very comfortable watching John get aged up to where we want him to be so that we can have him for the book that we want to write. And I'm really looking forward to see what else they do with John Kent, because I think they've got interesting opportunities, and I think they've taken him in a really interesting, fresh direction.
Well, and the nice thing about, fiction is that they could set other stories with John and Damien before John got aged up. They're just not doing it. And I like Clark and Lois because of reading so much Superboy. For a long time, I thought it should be Lana, but I've come around to it really should be Lois thing. Somebody on Twitter the other day said Superman's story begins when someone says Clark Kent meet Lois Lane. And I think that's an overstatement, but I think there's some validity to it. I loved the Super Sons stories, but I like John as he is now. Initially, I was really irritated when they aged him up so he could be Saturn Girl's boyfriend, because hello, Lightning Lad. So I was not a fan of that move. And that, for me at the time, it seemed like they aged him up so that he could be the inspiration for the Legion, which I was okay with. But then so he could date Saturn Girl, and I'm not okay with that. I'm just totally against that. So no. But I think it's an interesting family dynamic. And I liked what they did with young John. Like, there was a time when some people were coming to attack the Kent farmhouse, and Lois and John ran into the woods, and how they coped with that while John was helping. He wasn't in the way, even though he was a kid. And I really liked that mother and son team up. And it's reminiscent of in the TV show, I think it was in the second season, when Lois says to Jonathan, you and I are the normal people in a family of superheroes. We have to stick together. And I really liked that about that. So since we've started it, let's go on and talk about the Kent family. Ian, you want to start?
What exactly do you want to know about the Kent family?
Yeah, that was a really vague question, wasn't it? Let's talk about the Kent family in the current television show, or in any other movie incarnation, that the family dynamic between Clark and Lois.
Sure.
I'm really making a muddle of this. Can I say something else before you?
Sure.
Because I meant to say this when you were talking about Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, and how things tanked after they got married.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, Deborah Joy Levine created that series, and she wrote the first two seasons, or produced the first two seasons. And there was a lot of sexual tension between Lois and Clark. And then she got booted or stepped aside or whatever. And I think there are some people who have it in their heads that a married couple can't have sexual tension, and they can't have that kind of conflict, because I agree with you, the stories didn't seem to hit quite as well after that. So now that I've stepped onto my little soapbox, I'm going to step off my little soapbox. And what version of Superman and his family do you like, and how do you feel about John as a part of the comic book family?
Right. For me, all roads lead back to Smallville. Listen, as a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, Christopher Reeve will forever be Superman for me. And I heard somebody say this on the screen anyway, Smallville was the first iteration of Superman where the story was about Clark and not Superman. And I loved everything about it. I tuned in every week to watch Smallville. I had a VHS recorder ready to go because we didn't have TiVo yet to record it when I couldn't watch it. And I loved it. And the family dynamic is why I loved it. John Snyder was a great Jonathan Kent. Annette O'Toole, formerly Lana Lang in Superman 3, was a fantastic Martha Kent. And the relationship between those three characters of them and their adopted son was the heart and soul of why that show was so beloved. When you get on into season 2, and if I'm dealing with spoilers, I'm sorry, it's a 25-year-old show, get over it. But Jonathan goes to the cave to talk with Jor-El after Clark has run off to Metropolis. And basically he knows, I'm going to lay my life on the line here to bring my kid home. But that's what a father does. And so, yes, I will make that deal to get what I need to go save my boy. And the heart and soul of that, and the way they bore that out over the next like 2 or 3 seasons, because as fans, we all knew the end was nigh for Jonathan at that point. And the way that all came to a head, and I guess around season 5, it had such weight to it and such gravity, because you were so invested in the family dynamic of those 3 characters. Nobody's ever touched that for me. Not in the movies, not on television. As far as the new show goes, the new one on the CW, I've seen a couple of episodes. I have not really gotten into that one as much as some of the other stuff. I really like the guy who's playing Superman. I've read an interview with him, and he kind of compared that role to being, his days as being a baseball player. And so, the name on the front of the jersey is way more important than the name on the back. So I don't want people to know who I am. I just want them to see me as Superman. And I really respected him a lot for that. Character of John Kent, I'm just not as familiar with him because I'm not much into the comics anymore. I'm a writer. I'm super, super busy. My reading time is typically novels via audiobook. So I haven't had a chance to really experience much about him. But, if I'm going to pick up a comic anymore, I typically go back to the classics because it's been a very, very long time.
Okay. Chris?
When I think of the Kents, I think of the old Golden and Silver Age Superboy stories and Superboy and Adventure Comics. And I go back and reread those time and time again. So that's my favorite era. But I will give a nod to the early years of the John Byrne Superman, when I liked that the Kents were still alive. And as far as Jonathan Kent, I'm going to have to confess, I don't really even understand who he is. I don't read the the Superman comics anymore. And I know they started over with the New 52, and I read about, well, now it's the New 52 universe, but that Superman is somehow gone. And the pre-New 52 Lois and Clark have replaced them. And then somehow now they have a son, and I don't even understand who Jonathan Kent is. So I would be very wrong for me to offer an opinion about him.
Okay. Ange?
There's something about old school Pa Kent wisdom that I love. And so every so often in the comics, you'll get a story where Clark has some issue and he flies back home to the Kent farm, and they sit on the porch, and Jonathan gives some sepia colored, well, when I was a farmer, this happened. And it's like this lesson that gets learned. So I just can't get enough of that. I eat that up with a spoon. And so when you watch like the Christopher Reeve movies, and, Glenn Ford says, I know you weren't put on this earth to score touchdowns, right? And you're like, oh yeah, boy, that boom, right? That makes my head explode. And John Schneider saying, I don't want you to drive the fence posts in with your fist. I need you to dig the hole, right? So you know what hard work means, right? And that sort of stuff. All that stuff works for me. And so I like the Kents being alive, because I like that he can sort of, he can get real world advice from somebody who has lived a life as full as they've done. Now, when you get a Ma Kent wisdom story, then it's like, my head explodes. I just love those, but those are rarer than hen's teeth. I mean, when you get them, you just gobble it up and reread it and love it. I think that the one incarnation I don't like, and I don't know if I want to touch this third rail, is Kevin Costner as Pa Kent in Man of Steel, when he says, "Don't save the school bus." And don't save me. Let me get sucked up in the tornado. I mean, that makes no sense to me in any way, shape, or form. And so that is just a complete misread. I like John Kent because I do think that it gives a new dynamic now, because now Superman is Pa Kent and he's giving wisdom to his kid. When I was a kid, I got wisdom from my dad. Now I'm a dad and I'm trying to give wisdom to my kid. And so it makes it come a little bit full circle for me.
Okay. Elektra?
when we had Christopher Reeve, he taught us that a man could fly. I mean, and we all believed it. And that began the era of all the superhero stuff, which was fabulous. I'll agree with Ian that Smallville taught us about Clark Kent. And I think part of that dynamic was not just watching the Kents with Clark, but also watching what terrible parenting Lex Luthor went through with his dad, who was just, I mean, the epitome of bad parenting. Just awfulness. And now, too, we've got another Superman show on the air, and it is taking place on some other Earth because it bears no resemblance to any Superman that we've seen before. I mean, it's Superman and Lois, but they've got twins and there's stuff going on that just doesn't seem to make any sense that I can reconcile. So I've just decided that I like these characters and I'm going with it, but it's like watching a favorite book that's been adapted. I know these characters and I like them, and I'm just not trying to reconcile them with what I'm seeing on the screen because I just can't. And my mind can do that. I love the Dresden Files books, and I really enjoyed the Dresden Files TV series, but they did not take place in the same universe. They didn't, and that's okay. And this point of view works for me sometimes, and I'm enjoying it because I like watching people fly, and the more superhero stuff we get on TV and in the movies, the more we will continue to get. And that's good, because it used to be we got one thing. We got the Superman movies, and we got two good ones and one okay one, and then we will all forget that there was a fourth Superman movie. And then we waited a long time before we got that one Batman movie that was a shining beacon. Few and far between. So we are living in an era of riches where everybody has TiVo and things can be recorded. Some of us lived in the time of stone knives and bearskins before we could record things.
Yes, I remember the era of watch it when it's on or you don't see it, basically.
Or get up at 2 a.m. for HBO so that you can watch that thing you really wanted to see and then fall asleep halfway through it.
Yeah. I like in the comics, I like the current incarnation of the Kent family with Ma and Pa alive. As I said earlier, Clark brings his friends by. The various Superboys have stayed with them and benefited kind of from having Ma and Pa Kent keeping an eye on them. And I was not at all sure about the teenage boys thing in Lois and Clark at first. I mean, when it was, we're going to move to Smallville and they're like whinging about it, it's like, get a grip. Because sometimes your parents move and that's the best thing. And my years of teenage angst were a long time behind me, and I kind of like to keep them there. So revisiting teenage angst is not my favorite thing to do. But I do like John Kent as a character, despite not liking some of the things that were done with him when he was aged up. Because I think it's important for people who read a comic to have a character where they see some aspect of themselves. And I think John offers that to some readers in a way that he didn't before, and that not very many other characters do. And I like his relationship with Dick Grayson. It's another full circle thing. Superman was a mentor to Dick, and now Dick is a mentor to John, while Superman is off in space, fighting in arenas and fun stuff like that. And I liked that aspect of it. And I like the relationships that he's developing in the DC universe. And I think I'm not universally a fan of Tom Taylor. You could pay me a lot of money to do it, and I still would not read Deceased because zombies. But I do like what he's done with John Kent, and I'm looking forward to reading more of that. And since we've been talking about the movies, let's move from that to who is your favorite movie Superman and why? Chris.
Can I include television?
Sure.
I think Tom Welling, and why. See, the show was about Clark, so he captured that essence of Clark, and Clark learning the lessons from his parents and becoming the true hero that he is. Like people always say that Batman's the real person and Bruce Wayne is the act, but with Superman, it's Clark Kent who's the real person. And we got to spend, 9 or 10 years watching Clark grow up, and Tom Welling gave us that.
Ange?
Yeah, I mean, Christopher Reeve, I think, is just magic to me. I think that he really portrayed kind of that klutzy Clark that I kind of like sometimes, and also Superman so well. There's that scene in Superman 2 where he takes off the glasses and straightens up, and then puts the glasses back on and slumps down, and you go, oh, I guess it kind of could work as a secret identity. It's so simple. So I would probably say Christopher Reeve. I do think that Tyler Hoechlin, who currently is on the CW show, embraces that as well, really does a good job of that. And I really loved his couple of episodes he did on the Supergirl show, which I think is a different universe Superman, but the fact that he was so utterly charming as both Superman and Clark on that show, I think he's a great replacement.
Okay. Elektra?
I've also got to go with Christopher Reeve. He made us believe that a man could fly, and without him, we don't get any of the other ones. It's as simple as that.
Okay. Ian?
So obviously Christopher Reeve will always be Superman, and Tom Welling will always be Clark Kent for me. But I do want to give a shout out to Henry Cavill and Brandon Routh, both of whom I think were horribly misused by the respective regimes over at DC. I could not care less that they're going to try and reboot Superman again. I thought Henry Cavill was a great Superman who was given bad scripts, and he could have been everything we wanted Superman to be on the screen. Plus, he loves the character, true and true. Brandon Routh was another one that, he was a nobody actor. He got handed a script and was told, hit your marks, look, act, sound like Christopher Reeve. And I think if you go in and you watch the Crisis on Infinite Earths, crossover event on the CW, where he played the Kingdom Come Superman, you got a real flavor for what he could have been had they just given him a chance as Superman. For me, he was the best part going away of that miniseries. I loved it, and I really appreciate the fact that he got a chance to go in and at least on some level kind of right that wrong that was Superman Returns. But yeah, Chris Reeve, Tom Welling, all the way.
Well, I have to go in that direction too. I mean, for me, Christopher Reeve will always be the Superman in my head. And the sequence, Superman's first night, when he rescues Lois in the helicopter, and then he goes around Metropolis solving problems and catching criminals, is one of my all-time favorite ever movie sequences. I just love it. And that at that moment that Ange was talking about has been going around on Twitter, where he's about to tell Lois the truth. He takes off his glasses and he straightens up and his voice deepens. And then he reconsiders, and it was magic. I mean, I guess that's why they call it acting, but it was like magic. And I also agree with what Ian said about Brandon Routh and Henry Cavill. And one of my longstanding complaints with DC movies is that they tend to cast a relative unknown as the title character, and then they cast a major star who therefore has to have boatloads of screen time in what should be a supporting role. And that was part of my problem with Kevin Costner. I've loved lots of things Kevin Costner's done. I thought he did okay as Pa Kent, but that moment when Jonathan is like, don't save me because hello, super speed. I mean, it was just infuriating. And then Russell Crowe is a wonderful actor, and I've liked him in a bunch of things, but this was not the Jor-El story. And they were turning parts of it into the Jor-El story. And so I agree that Henry Cavill was not well served by that script. And then Brandon Routh hardly had anything to do. And when Perry White's nephew is a more interesting character than Superman, you have a problem that has nothing to do with the actor. I watched that movie and I was thinking, I was so ready to like this. And I don't. And so I agree that he was wonderful as the Kingdom Come Superman. So I just have a couple of more questions here. Does anybody want to add anything to favorites, not favorites, things you wish had been done differently about the movies or even the TV shows?
I mean, I'll just say that for all of the love that I have for Smallville, I do kind of wish it had ended about 3 seasons earlier than it did. They were really stretching, particularly with the Lana Lang angles and stuff like that. And it did get a bit long in the tooth. But in the end, when he finally gets the suit and flies, it was the moment we all waited for.
And I'll jump on and just say that there are parts of the Brandon Routh Superman that are amazing, and there are parts of the Henry Cavill Superman that are amazing. And if you could just splice out all of those little bits and put them together, it'd be great. I mean, the jet plane rescue scene in Superman Returns is about the most amazing Superman action sequence I think I have seen. And that's what, 20 years ago, 18 years ago. That is Superman all over. So I do wish that those guys had better scripts.
Well, that leads into my next question, which is a story question. People always say Superman is so hard to write. And why do you think they say that, Elektra?
Because he's got so many powers, and you have to find either a villain or a good storyline so that he can't just use super speed to go over there and rescue them before it happens. And the really, really good stories for Superman are the ones that take both ingenuity and cleverness and timing, and where his opponent comes up with something that he can't solve and says, well, you've got to do A or B. And Superman comes up with a way to do A and B. Like, I think it's the first Christopher Reeve movie where, things just go horribly, horribly wrong. And he spins the earth back to save Lois Lane, because he's not going to let things blow up, and he's not going to let Lex Luthor win, but he's also not going to let Lois Lane die. And he finds a way to save everybody and the girl, because he's Superman. It might have been the second one.
I'm sorry, what?
With all of the coastline properties.
First one.
It's the one with Zod, I think.
It was supposed to be the one with Zod. If you go back and watch the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, that was the ending. He had created a 2-movie arc. The studio wasn't convinced that Superman was going to sell, and so they made him take the ending from Superman 2 and make that the ending of the Superman film. So,
it's been a while since I've seen them, and I spent the afternoon watching the Max Fleischer cartoons. So,
we haven't even talked about those.
My man Tim Daly was a great voice for Superman.
Yeah,
he was, and the first time I saw the Fleischer cartoons was at a convention in New York. I didn't even know they existed. And the animation was just wonderful in those. I've totally lost track of where I am. Chris, why do you think it's so hard for people to write about Superman?
I think they missed the point that what we were talking about earlier, that Superman's this amazing character because of the type of person Clark is, and it's his relationships with other people and the way he behaves that make him interesting. Not, we have to find something that's a threat to someone with these incredible powers in every issue. And I think people get hung up on that. Well, how can you endanger Superman? How can you create any suspense? And that's why they think that he's hard to write for. But I don't want to see Superman get beat up, or I don't know. The older I get bored during action sequences in superhero movies and TV shows. If they go on for more than a couple of minutes, I find myself zoning out. So I'm not looking for that kind of threat to Superman to make a story interesting.
Okay. Ange?
I think we live in a very cynical time. And I think that if you said to almost anybody, I am going to give you omnipotence, that most people would get corrupted by it. And I think it's very hard to have conflict if you're writing somebody who has all of these powers and is just such a stand-up guy. And I think even in comics and everything else, there is the tendency to want to give your heroes feet of clay, and the tendency to want to give villains a sympathetic backstory to help them understand, to help you understand why they're doing what they're doing. Gone is the day of I'm just evil because I'm evil and I'm a good guy because I'm a good guy, right? Everything is kind of shades of gray. And so I think it's very hard for modern day writers to say, I'm going to just write this guy that is a stand-up good guy no matter what happens, right? Because in real life, I don't think we see that much, let alone somebody with all of these powers. One of the stories that I like is Brian Bendis was saying that while he was writing Superman, he found himself being a better person. He was so enmeshed in the Superman character that he was finding, like, I was returning people's grocery carts to the supermarket, and I was doing all of these small little things just to help people, just because I was so into his character, which I think is what I love about him. So I think when everybody's like, he's a Boy Scout and he's boring because why doesn't he just kill Lex Luthor and gather up the plastic in the ocean and throw it into the sun? They're missing the point.
Okay. Ian, I think I skipped you. Do you want to speak to that question?
I mean, I think everybody nailed it. If you don't think you can tell a good Superman story, then maybe you've just never tried to write a story before. I mean, listen, anytime I hear that, I think of Richard Donner. And I saw an interview with him and he was handed the script and they came to him because he was a big league actor or a big league director. And they said, we need a big league director and a big league star like Marlon Brando to sell a movie about a guy in tights, frankly. And Donner read the script and he came back to the studio and he said, listen, it's great. We can do all these effects and we can put them on wires and we can do all these things and have all these effects. This movie doesn't work if the audience doesn't believe in these two kids falling head over heels in love with each other. That's the movie. That's the whole story. If you don't sell the audience on that, none of this other stuff is going to matter and you're going to waste your money. So you let me worry about that. You let me drive that home and we'll have the audience loving a Superman movie. And, for all the marketing push about You'll Believe a Man Could Fly, the relationship between Lois and Superman was the heart and soul of the movie, heart and soul of the franchise. And it all started because Richard Donner had that vision to be able to understand that and say, that's what needs to be the core and the heart and soul of this film, not the effects. I think writing stories for Superman is the same way. Anytime you center and you focus a story on the human side of things, you can't go wrong with that, even with a guy that's as powerful as he is.
Okay. I have one more question, but before we get to it, is there anything anybody would like to talk about that we haven't touched on? Okay, well, the question is, this pops up on social media every now and again. Christopher Reeve did an interview back in the day, and somebody asked him what he thought was important about Superman. And his response was almost straight out of the movie, that Superman is a friend. Superman is somebody who cares about everybody. And I think I know what you're all going to say after we've had this lengthy discussion. But just to get it on record, do you agree or disagree? Chris?
I agree 100%, which is probably no surprise to anyone who, as you said, anyone who's been listening to us this whole time, but I agree with that 100%.
Okay. Ange?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a friend. I'm here to help. Those are the two things that he should always be saying. There's nothing more tiresome than the evil Superman stories that we get where he's putting his fist through the Joker's chest, taking over the planet. That's it. I'm done with them. So please stop doing them. I'm a friend and I'm here to help.
Yeah. Elektra?
I hadn't heard about that interview. I'll have to go look for it, but I also agree 100%. It's good to know that he really got Superman.
Ian?
I agree 150,000 gazillion %. And if I can harken back to my earlier soapbox about Henry Cavill, I think he got it too.
Mhm.
And he was never given a chance to show it. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, totally agree.
So it's unanimous. So we on this panel have decided, and therefore thus shall it be. If only. But yeah, when I saw that clip, it kind of brought tears to my eyes because it'd been so long. And somebody, as we're recording this, it's the 20th anniversary of Christopher Reeve's appearance on Smallville. And so that's kind of people, I've seen the picture going through social media. Might have been yesterday, but I think it was today that it turned up in my feed. And so I guess that's about it. We'll wrap up here, but I'd like to give all our panelists a chance to tell us where we can find information about them, information about their work. If you have a new or upcoming release you'd like to bring to people's attention, this is a good time to do that. And we'll start with Ange.
I run a Supergirl blog fan site called Comic Box Commentary, but I review every Superman comic that comes off the shelf new. So if you're interested in any of the more recent stuff, you can just go there. But I also delve into the back issue boxes. I concentrate mostly on Supergirl, though. So that's where you can find me.
Okay. Elektra?
You can find everything about me at untilmidnight.com, and you can find me on Mastodon at Elektra at Wandering Shop.
Okay. Ange, what's your URL for the blog?
Sorry, I had to find the mute button. It's Comic Box Commentary, all one word, .blogspot.com. But if you type Supergirl blog into Google, I'm always number one.
Okay. Ian?
So yeah, everything about me is on ianjmalone.net. Again, that's ianjmalone.net. I am on Facebook and I'm on Twitter at ianjmalone. So come check that out. Again, I got a new release coming out March 17th that I'm just super, super excited about. It was probably the hardest book I ever wrote, but when I turned it into my editor, I told my wife, I think we've got something very special here. So keep an eye out for that. March 17th, last Argonaut.
Okay. Chris?
Again, I'm not a creative type. I'm an IT guy, so I don't have a large online presence, but I am the central mailer of Interlac, the Amateur Press Association devoted to the Legion of Superheroes that's 47 years old and still going strong. And you can find information about us on our Facebook page.
And you can always find me here on ConTinual, the convention that never sleeps. I also have a website, nancynorthcott.com, where there's information about my books. And in terms of social media, most active on Twitter, probably more than is actually healthy for me. And I'm at Nancy Northcott on Twitter. You can find me there. And you can find me here on ConTinual. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining in tonight. It's been a fun discussion. I really appreciate it. I'd like to also thank our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. For more information about them, you can visit heroesonline.com.